Coming up on this week's show, how to turn your iPhone into a classic PC.
A long-lost Pokemon game gets rediscovered.
And we go inside Nintendo and the classic Earthbound with Marcus Lindblom.
The Retro Hour podcast is made possible each week with our wonderful friends at Bitmap Books. Now, if you're an old school fan of the Game Boy, we need to tell you about this incredible new book of theirs, Game Boy, the Box Art Collection, that celebrates the wonders of Nintendo's million-selling portable system. Check out that and lots more on their website at bitmapbooks.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 271, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And great to have you joining us for another nostalgia-filled episode where we reminisce about classic video games, take you behind the scenes with the people that actually made them back in the day, with a healthy dose of personal nostalgia laid on as well. Because, actually I've been realising recently, retro gaming now, it seems is actually a genre in itself, isn't it? If you go in any of the kind of digital stores, like the Nintendo eStore or your Xbox and search retro gaming, it's now a legitimate genre of gaming.
I've been noticing that with streamers as well.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's a whole retro category on Twitch now.
Oh, gosh. I wonder if we fit into that with your Twitch.
Yeah. I've been tagging myself in it.
But no, you are right. I was on Xbox Arcade, Xbox Arcade, God, that's retro, Xbox Live the other day, and they had a 70% off sale, and I went into it, and there was a retro section, and I downloaded, DuckTales for 50p.
It does feel like it's something that, because when we started doing this podcast 5 years ago, that kind of felt like, retro was kind of at its peak then, didn't it? We kind of felt like we started doing the show when maybe retro were peaked and we wondered, is it still going to be a thing in another 5-6 years? But it just seems like it's getting bigger all the time.
Now the companies are on board and stuff. It's starting to change. And, this week's guest is from the biggest gaming company in the world. And we hardly talk about them because it's really hard to get guests about Nintendo. We've had, folks talk about Rare and other companies, but getting a Nintendo guest, oh God, really tough.
Yeah, today we're going to be joined by Marcus Lindblom. And you're right, we talk about Nintendo pretty much every week in the news section, but actually getting a guest on who worked at Nintendo is really difficult because a lot of them sign, NDAs that often last beyond the time that they were employed there. And I know Marcus, for example, you're going to hear in the interview we did very soon, he tried to release a book about his time at Nintendo and they blocked it. So they're very protective, about kind of letting the outside world in, if you like. But Marcus is going to come on today and tell us some stories because, he's got such an interesting history. He lived in Japan for 4 years in the late 80s, obviously when the arcade scene was huge out there. And I know you've been out there in more recent years, Joe, but you can imagine what an exciting place that must have been back in 1989.
Yeah, man, that would have been unreal. I would have loved to have just kind of stepped back for a week into 1989 and just kind of see it or something. So that's going to be really interesting to hear about.
You'd be like, everything's so slow at loading.
Yeah, probably.
Well, one of the things we talk about in this interview, Marcus, he's best known for doing the English version of the game Earthbound. And really, I do say version because it wasn't a straight translation. He didn't just have the job of, translating Japanese into English. He actually kind of rewrote a lot of the story in there and changed a lot of the things that were only really relevant to a Japanese audience, so it'd work in America. So it was quite a big job doing that. And we talk a lot more in the interview about the process that they used back in the day to do these kind of translations of Japanese games to Western audiences. Because, infamously, there were so many bad translations, particularly in the NES era, wasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it's not so much a translation, it's a localization. I wonder if that's something, because Earthbound, correct me if I'm wrong, it didn't come out in the UK until much, much, much later, decades later. So, maybe that's got something to do with kind of the localization of it as well. It's like, oh God, it's hard enough to make it American, let alone, for the United Kingdom.
The interesting thing is this is such a Joe episode as well. And Joe only manages to get the Amiga episodes, don't you, where you can come on it.
Well, I was going to say the original idea was for me to do the interview, wasn't it? But unfortunately, my 9 till 5 job, which isn't always 9 till 5, caused me to be working 11 till 8 at the moment. So yeah, I couldn't jump on it, which was really upsetting because I don't actually know that much about Earthbound. I know it was Mother. And I know, it's part of a series and stuff like that. But yeah, I would have loved to have jumped on that, one of our first ever Nintendo episodes as well.
Well, It's amazing because Marcus talks about how he was working for Nintendo USA and how Nintendo of America and how they work with the Japanese Nintendo and actual staff members came over. But then how he worked with guys later on, like met Dylan Cuthbert, the guys from Argonaut that did Star Fox. There's a whole connection there, and Nintendo made sure their quality was still on the product in the end. So, I think you're really going to enjoy listening to this one, Joe. Yeah, and of course the audience.
It's not just for me.
You're right. This is such a Joe episode. So it means you can kick back and just enjoy the interview this week, Joe. He's really good. Marcus Lindblom is coming up on the Retro Hour podcast in around 20 minutes from now. Now, while we're talking about Nintendo, actually, I did quickly mention this in the intro to this week's show. Bitmap Books, our sponsor, they have got the most incredible book, if you're a fan of the Game Boy, that you need to check out.
Yeah, man, this is absolutely awesome. We go on about Bitmap Books all the time, but the quality of these books is absolutely fantastic. And like you say, if you're a fan of Nintendo, then you've got to be a fan of the Game Boy. This is the Game Boy, the box art collection, which is over almost 400 pages of just pixel box art of all these different classic Game Boy games. And what I really love about it is, as well as the beautiful artwork, you just get nice little simple, text paragraphs just about the game as well, when it came out and stuff like that. I'm a simple guy, just straightforward and simple like that is amazing. These make absolutely amazing gifts as well. Dan got me one of these a couple of years ago. It's so much better than getting, a jumper or something like that. Go out there, pick this up.
I was going to get you a jumper for your birthday this year.
I know, there we go. Well, get me the Game Boy box art collection.
I do love about
jumpers.
What I love about this book is that it celebrates the box art on Game Boy games. And really, looking at these, really paying attention to the quality of them, because obviously they're a lot smaller than kind of, a SNES cartridge, the bigger boxes that you got with those. And I didn't realize actually how detailed and how vibrant a lot of these are, and the fact that they really enhance these images and you get them over big pages in this book. You can really see, the attention to detail that was included in a lot of these box art.
Even when you go to like video game shows, you see like Game Boy carts just stacked up. And you don't see the boxes or the manuals or that kind of art.
Yeah, your mum's always threw them out. So it's interesting to actually see, like Dan says, the blown up box art, because we're so used to just seeing the little like 2-inch cartridge with like an inch sticker on it, which is half filled up with, Nintendo seal, quality seal of approval and stuff like that. So this is really cool to actually get your hands on it and, like you say, see it in like a proper book.
I did wonder as well, the fact that the Game Boy had obviously monochrome graphics and the fact that, like you said, the cartridges were so small, whether they actually worked harder on making the box art really draw you in, because it's really all they had to work with, really, isn't it?
Yeah, try and sell it more, I guess.
So definitely worth a look if you're a fan of the Game Boy, a real celebration of Game Boy box art, and you can get that right now. And of course, support the Retro Hour podcast by supporting our sponsors on their website at bitmapbooks.co.uk. Now, we've got plenty of news stories to talk about this week. Now, this one popped up on Reddit last week, and people have been going wild for this. Now, this is a sealed Pokemon Blue cart. Now, this is a box version of the game from 1998 that's been found, and this was actually supposed to be someone's birthday gift back in 1998. Now, I'm not sure if you know how much a sealed box copy of Pokemon Blue goes for these days, but it is generally a small fortune if you see one of these on eBay.
I'm confused because, like, Pokemon, I remember loads of people having red and blue and stuff. And why is blue so rare? Maybe it's because it's Pokemon or Pokecards or something.
So I think the thing is with Pokemon, so obviously it started with Pokemon Red and Blue. That's, how the whole craze started. It came out in Japan in 96, and then I think, America and UK, and I think it was like 98. I just don't think, as crazy as it was, as big as a game as it was, I just don't think they made, like, obviously they probably made a couple of million of them, but they're just not been made in the quantities that the later games were made in. And obviously it kind of comes back to what we were just saying about, the book just then. A lot of I know hardly anybody who ever kept, I don't think any of my friends growing up, because I'm true Game Boy and Game Boy, the Game Boy Advance, kind of like, I'm the perfect age for that when I was a kid. None of us had the boxes. None of us had the manuals. I got Pokemon Red and Blue in Christmas '99. I couldn't tell you what happened to the box, and like they were gone straight away. Like, my mum chucked them out or anything. So it's actually the box which is rare, I think, rather than the cartridge.
I guess they absolutely rinsed them as well. Like when Pokemon came out and kids got it, they were playing that for a good 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So having a sealed one in original condition with the manuals and everything, well rare. How was it found?
It was in his parents' attic. It was meant to be his birthday present in 1998, and they got him red and blue because that seemed to be like the thing. Like everybody seemed to get them both together, and he doesn't really know how, but they lost blue and didn't really realise they lost it. So he just got red for his birthday. And now his parents have retired, and he's obviously grown up. His parents were doing like a big clear out and they found it in the attic.
Completely boxed, never opened.
Yeah.
And then some people on the Reddit thread here are saying, it mentions in this article on Unilad that we'll link up in our show notes that they've been selling for upwards of $3,000. Some people have linked eBay auctions where they've gone for $5,000. Yeah. But the nice story here is the fact that this guy, he said that he's grateful to have such wonderful parents who not only bought him the 2 Pokemon games, admittedly, he didn't get the second one for 23 years, but he's not going to sell it. He's actually going to treasure this. And, it's going to be his birthday gift from his dad, even though it took that long to get to him. Yeah. He's going to look after it and maybe even play it, which a lot of people are kicking off about.
Yeah, and I love that, to be fair, like you say, everybody's saying, you should get it graded, but get it in a plastic box and all this. And he was just saying, I'm not going to sell it. It's the nostalgia. And he's got nostalgia for the Pokemon games. He says, playing them with his sister, playing Pokemon Stadium with his parents, So I think that's awesome that he's going to keep it. And he's not keeping it as like, I'm going to keep this so it's worth even more in a couple of years. He's keeping it because his dad got it him.
My mind's blown by this article. I'm amazed that it's so rare. Is it like Link and Zelda or something like that? They're always really rare, or like Mario, it's so iconic.
It's not.
Hey, look, last week that Mario Kart, that Mario cartridge, it went for like $660,000. I think it's just the fact that everyone got them and ripped them open, and there's just not many sealed left. I guess.
Yeah, it's not so much the game is rare because I'm sure if we Google it, Pokemon Blue probably sold like 5 million copies. It's that there's just no boxes for it. It's because of Nintendo. Up until the GameCube, they always had cardboard boxes for games, and they just got thrown out and they just got destroyed. Like you say, just ripped apart, ripped open. Pokemon was aimed for the kids. It was a game that like anybody from like 5 years old up to whenever, but it was mostly like 7, 8, 9-year-olds that were playing it. They weren't looking after these boxes. They were just ripping them apart, throwing them in the bin straight away. So it's the fact that it's in such good condition that it's so rare, I think.
I was using a copy of Quake to hold my monitor up.
There you go.
Boxed,
there you go.
And then I went on eBay and I was like, oh my God.
my mate about 5 years ago gifted me Worms Party for the PS1. He used to use it as a paint palette for his Warhammer. So the box is just completely painted over.
I got this from a charity shop for £2.
Yeah, exactly. So it's crazy, isn't it?
It does make you think that, and I've been thinking this probably for the last 10 years or so, that every game I buy, particularly ones that are kind of famous franchises, like, Mario games and stuff like that, should I buy 2 copies and keep one sealed? They're still going to be worth
Dan,
money
you just
in like
keep them
20
sealed
years.
anyway because you don't play them. Red Dead Redemption 3 years later.
I should have left it on for another 20 years. It'd be worth a fortune.
It's retro by now.
So yeah, that is very good. I love the fact that, that the guy who's found it is keeping it for sentimental reasons and not just talking it for money. That's, lovely story, I think that. So it just makes you wonder what else is lurking in people's attics and stuff around the world, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Now let's talk about this story, Metroid Prime's 2D fan remake. Now this is something, obviously a GameCube classic back in the day, but this has been something that we've been seeing online for quite a while now, that apparently this fan-made 2D remake that they're calling Prime 2D is now actually playable. Because I thought this was an April Fool's Day joke when I saw it a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, so I sort of familiar with the Metroid games. I've got Super Metroid for the SNES, and I've completed it, but I've not completed it since I was like 12. I played Metroid Prime 1 and 2 for the GameCube and enjoyed them, but I borrowed them off friends. So this actually went into development in 2004. So the team behind it, a group of guys called Team SCU, who are indie game developers from what I understand, and they've been working on this for 17 years. Now, they went quiet 5 years ago. So in 2017, they posted saying that they were still working on it, but they hadn't posted anything in 5 years at that point. And then they haven't really posted much since 2017. But like you say, on April 1st, they posted this, and people have, you're not the only one. A lot of people assumed it was an April Fool's joke when they posted all the like screenshots of it and stuff. But no, it's out there. The demo is out there. I've been watching people play it, and it's racking up some views, a couple of 100,000 views, on people's playthroughs, which has only been out for a few days. And it looks like you can play like the first 20, 25 minutes of the game, and it looks beautiful. It looks absolutely beautiful.
So the original Metroid Prime was kind of 3D. They've 2D'ized it, and
So the original Metroid Prime for the GameCube, there was 3 of them. They were essentially first-person shooters, but they were like puzzle platformer first-person shooters, obviously in fully 3D, and they're beautiful games as well. Like they look, stunning for the GameCube. Obviously, Metroid, Super Metroid, and then like Metroid, what's it called? Metroid Fusion, I think it's called. They're all like classic 2D Metroid games. And essentially, that's what they've done to this. They've made it look like one of those kind of like, SNES kind of Game Boy Advance games. But it looks really modern at the same time. You'd have to look at it, Ravi, but it looks beautiful.
It's nice, though, because usually you think the route would be like Metro Prime HD, and they'd do like a, Unreal Engine version. But to see it in a kind of 2D, like nicely done sprites, maybe you'll be able to play some levels that you remember in first person in like a 2D different way, kind of more platformery.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it comes from people have been begging for this, like they've been begging for an official, Metroid game for a while. Like they've done a few spin-off ones and stuff like that. And I think it's Metroid Prime 4, was announced like 4 years ago and it's still not out. I could be wrong. But this looks like it, for the Switch, it just looks like a proper spiritual successor. This looks like it could have been done by Nintendo. And it doesn't look like they've grabbed assets from like other games. It looks like they've built it from the ground up to me.
It looks bang on, like the parallax scrolling and stuff in the background. And it just looks really well done, like a proper release.
Yeah, I'm sure next week, though, it'll be gone. It'll be cease and desist.
That's the point I was going to make here. It's saying here, there's an article on Polygon that I'll put in our show notes. And there was actually another fan game, I think we talked about at the time, actually, another Metroid 2 remake that was back in 2017. Yeah. A day later, as soon as that went online, Nintendo did a copyright claim, shut the project down. Over 14,000 people have downloaded Prime 2D already.
Oh, wow.
But it does kind of feel like the fact that they're using these assets, it does feel like Nintendo obviously are going to have to close it down because it's what Nintendo's lawyers do.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder why they've devoted so much time to doing this, knowing that it's got such a limited shelf life. It's a bit odd.
Yeah, but at the same time, they released it on April 5th, and we're now at the point of recording this, it's April 13th, and it's still up there. So knowing our luck, it'll be gone by the time the episode comes out in 3 days. But yeah, usually Nintendo are a little bit quicker than that, aren't they? So maybe they've just not figured it out yet. Maybe they've just not seen it yet. But like you say, 14,000 downloads. The video I was watching earlier on had 150,000 plays.
I think they must be huge fans to do this. But 15 years, isn't it?
Yeah, 15 years, over 15 years. So we'll see.
Before the game was retro.
Yeah, before the game. Yeah, exactly. Isn't it funny? We look at it now and it's like, oh yeah, that looks like a Metroid retro. Bloody hell. That looks like a retro DS game or a retro Game Boy Advance game. But when they were making it, it was probably all new tech.
I do love as well, there is a couple of comments on this article. There's a bit of a sweepstake going on how long Nintendo are going to cease and desist it. Is it going to be a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks? So that's running here as well. And they're saying here, really, the hype with Nintendo fan-made games, it's difficult because it's kind of like Fight Club, If you talk about it, you've ensured the demise of it, really. So we probably haven't contributed much to the efforts of this by mentioning it on the podcast, but grab it while you can. What's interesting, I wonder, though, if they might do this as a way to get attention onto the project, then obviously they're waiting for Nintendo's cease and desist to come along, but whether then they're going to kind of relaunch it with their own kind of branding on it, that could be a good way of getting marketing, I think.
Yeah, you know what? There was a game, we never really spoke about it, but there was a game called Daymare 1998, which essentially came from, we're going a little bit off topic here, it's a Resident Evil 4 clone, but what happened was the guys, it was an Italian studio, indie studio, and they were making a Resident Evil 2 fan remake in the Resident Evil 4 engine around 2015, 2014. And essentially they got contacted by Capcom, you got to stop making this because we're actually making a Resident Evil 2 remake. But you know what Capcom did? They invited them down to the studio and said, this is what we're working on. And they invited all the team down and said this, and they actually helped them make Daymare 1998. They actually helped them, gave them ideas and said, this is a really cool remake you guys are making. unfortunately, we need you to stop making it, but, you know, this is what we're doing at the moment. Go make
Could be,
your own game with it.
Like Sonic Mania, you know, get them on board.
Yeah.
Do this and release it for the Switch.
Yeah, but
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
if Nintendo had sense to do that, I can't see them doing it.
I can't see them doing it either, but I'm just saying, you know, maybe they should take a leaf out of, like, say, Sega's book and Capcom's book.
Yeah, or whether they'll just kind of, maybe they've got another version ready to go without the Metroid branding on there. You know, and it's going to be their own game, just, you know, influenced by it. Maybe they could get around it that way, which would be
Retroid.
a good way of doing it.
Retroid.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. You heard
Have
it
that
here
idea
first.
on us. So if you do want to grab it, providing it's still up when the show goes live, we'll put it in our show notes and everything else we talk about at theretrohour.com. Now, Ravi, I know you're excited to get your new iPhone that should be arriving very soon. Obviously, when you unbox your iPhone, the first thing you're going to do, I imagine, is to transform it into an MS-DOS PC.
I'd love to do that, but carrying around everything would be a bit awkward, wouldn't it?
Now, this is a YouTuber called Niles Mitchell who's done just that. Now, you've got to check out this video. It's about 17 minutes long, and he's actually set up his iPhone on a little stand with a floppy disk drive, a CD-ROM drive, a PS2 keyboard, PS2 mouse, and actually he's running a DOS emulator on here, and you can actually use all these devices via the the adapter that lets you plug a camera into your iPhone, the USB interface. He's using an emulator called iDOS that lets the iPhone talk to all these different peripherals, and he can actually use it like it was a PC from back in about 1995.
I think it's amazing the fact that it's an emulator on the iPhone that's running, because Android, you can load up loads of emulators, you can have ROMs, but iOS and Apple, they're really, really kind of cautious about having ROMs being loaded or other pieces of code being loaded onto it. And I'm amazed that this is on the actual App Store.
Well, the story of that is actually mentioned in the video, and it's quite interesting because this emulator, iDOS, it's kind of been off and on the iOS store for a couple of years. Like you mentioned, you know, when it did originally appear back in 2010, it first went onto the store. It was only on for a short while, and then Apple pulled it down for the reason you said. You know, they didn't want emulators that could run third-party code at that time. And then it appeared again about 6 years ago called iDOS 2, and Apple have actually left it alone since then. And then he made a big update last September. Now, you know, obviously stuff on the iPhone can access document storage on the device now. And he was amazed that Apple let him actually store files onto iPhones and load them into his emulator. So that means you can download all of your disk images from your old DOS games, put them on your iPhone. And obviously that makes an emulator so much more useful, having access to storage.
It's mad that you can do that, because, like, you know, even transferring from the iPhone, if you're doing a backup, you have to do it in iTunes, or like with the latest Mac Minis and the new Apple Silicon, it won't let you install it remotely onto a separate drive like your main drive. You know, it's all starting to get even more locked down than it previously was, and it's mad that, you know, he's saying you got a floppy disk drive working with it, and the way that it worked was it was an imitation super disk drive, which is just mad.
Yeah, he said there is some workarounds that you have to do to get this working, because obviously you can't just plug in a standard disk drive into your iPhone and it recognises it. But there is, it's a device here called the iMation Super Disk Drive, and it was around the era when the zip drives were around, but it was also backwards compatible to standard 3.5-inch floppy disks. So the way it appears to the emulator is like a zip drive, essentially. So it's a D drive. So, you know, rather than having like an A drive on the machine, it recognizes it as D. And then the CD-ROM drive that he's got is a special one that's designed for smart TVs, which are often locked down in the same way that your iPhone is. So actually, it appears to the system like a FAT32, like USB drive. So it can recognize it as an external hard disk, but it's a CD-ROM drive. So there is quite a bit of working around these had to do. But if you watch this video, he's on there playing all these old school games, and it does run like, you know, a decent MS-DOS emulator that obviously not the keyboard and the mouse and the drives would fit in your pocket.
Imagine if you could cast that as well. So you could just use it as your little device, and then there was maybe a cast option or some kind of hack that you could do to cast it to your TV, and then use that as an MS-DOS computer, and the like iPhone as the little driver. You know, it's pretty cool.
You can do screen mirroring, actually, so I imagine you probably could do that.
Yeah, that
if you got an Apple
could
TV.
work. And like, or on your Chromecast or whatever, or plug one in, hack one into a CRT. That's the way to do it, isn't it? And then put your phone up. But it's probably really easy to do in Android, this is. But like seeing it on the iPhone is pretty impressive with that whole kind of lockdown and walled garden approach that they have.
Because, I've got a Pentium 1 PC next to me, and this thing is a beast. If I lift it up, it hurts my back. But the fact that now we can walk around with something, infinitely more powerful than that can run the same software, and you just put it in your shirt pocket, it is amazing how far we've come in a couple of decades, isn't it?
I want to have a go now. As soon as I get that new iPhone, I'm on it.
First thing you're going to do, Ravi. Now, of course, we're going to be talking about Earthbound very soon. Now, there's actually been a fan reimagining what Earthbound would look like as a modern 3D game. Now, it's obviously quite a visual story because you need to see the pictures to appreciate this, but I'm sure we can describe it, and we will link it in our show notes as well. But it kind of looks a bit like... Yeah, if you got Earthbound and you made it a modern game, it reminds me a bit of the Zelda Link's Awakening graphics, that kind of claymation look.
Or even kind of Animal Crossing.
Yeah. You know what? That's a good... Actually, it look like a bit of a cross of Link's Awakening, the remake, and Animal Crossing, to kind of like picture it. But yeah, I think, you say this is a fan visualization, isn't it, of Earthbound, aka Mother. I feel like Nintendo...
It's the first game, actually, Mother, yeah. Not Earthbound.
Okay. Yeah. So I feel like Nintendo need to do this because of there's a massive cult kind of following to the Mother games, Earthbound games, and you just don't see enough about it in, like, I know it came, a couple of them came out in America and stuff like that, but they were quite limited from what I understand, and there was translations for the Game Boy Advance, and, I think only one of them came out for the SNES. I could be wrong, but I just feel like they should do this. They did it with Zelda, and I think it will sell, like, if they did this, because this looks beautiful.
And it's kind of done it in Blender, which is a 3D program for the PC, so maybe they could take the assets and actually put this into a game engine and make this like a playable demo, which would just be amazing to see. But it's really in a beautiful style. Like, the lighting's fantastic on this.
What I think's interesting, though, just to kind of say how beautiful it is. Now, I'm not going to butcher his name, but when the guy who made this tweeted it, he tagged the creator, the Japanese creator of the games, and said, "Thank you for creating such an amazing game," and he retweeted it as well.
Oh, that's good.
So, but I'm not going to butcher his name because it's Japanese and I can't. But I think that's really cool that, as a fan, you make that, and then the actual original creator is just like, yeah, that's beautiful.
It makes it all worthwhile. But what is interesting, though, because we'll hear more, obviously, in the interview with Marcus that's coming up in a moment, is that, the Mother, actually, obviously, we didn't get it over here, and then Earthbound came out in America, but actually the sales on Earthbound originally were very disappointing, and we kind of go into that. A lot of people blamed Nintendo's marketing that was trying to be too edgy for, their style, and really, the sales figures were a disappointment. But over the years, it's kind of got that cult following now, and we saw it when it got released on the NES Classic, that it does kind of feel like the time could be right for them to do like an HD remaster and actually people to appreciate a lot more than they did when the original game came out.
Yeah, and a lot more people do know about it now, and the fact that, like, even in, the original Smash Bros, you could play as Ness. He was definitely in Smash Bros. Melee, but I'm not sure if he was in the first one, but he was the main character from Earthbound. And I remember playing Smash Bros. Melee and just being like, "Oh, who's Ness?" And my mate was like, "Oh, he's just like a Nintendo character because he's named after Ness, NES kind of thing." But now, I think, we just didn't know what Earthbound was in the UK. But now so many more people know who that is, and they know who these characters are from these Japanese games and stuff. So, like you say, I think it definitely is the right time for it.
Yeah, and the world's a lot smaller now as well. People find out about franchises that we were disconnected from as kids. So come on, Nintendo, make it happen. Now, before we get into our interview with Marcus, it's time to mention this, actually, a really cool, another fan remake, actually, which seems to be kind of a bit of a theme this week. Maybe people have had more time during lockdown over the last year to focus on these things, but whatever the reason is, I'm glad that they're doing it. And this is Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge for the Atari STE. Now, obviously, we've done an entire episode with Sean Southern about 2 years ago. We talked about the Lotus games. One of my favourite racing series. Used to love that as a kid. Lotus 2 was always my favourite, but the original game, definitely one of the most loved racing games from back in the early 90s. But the version on the Atari ST, which I actually didn't think was a bad version, there is an upgraded version of this that's available now if you've got the more enhanced model, the Atari STE, that came out later. But actually, even though it had more powerful hardware, you know the way it works. Usually developers will make a game for the lowest common denominator and they won't release a special version for something that, only a small section of the user base has got. But now, all these years later, 30 years on, there is a new fan version, Lotus STE, version 1.0, that's available to download for free now. And they've put some really cool upgrades in here. Now, they've actually used some of the hardware that you only find in the Atari STE, including using the Blitter chip to make the graphics much more smooth than the original. It scrolls really nicely. You've got more scenery there too. The background mountains move from side to side. They've got nice color gradients in the sky, and even improved the music and the sound effects in the game as well. So really, it's a major upgrade from the original game that really puts it on par with the Amiga and the Mega Drive version, which, for a fan to upgrade a game 30 years later to bring it up to that level, I think is pretty impressive.
It's good to see some love for the STE, because a lot of people just default do go to the ST. And this is a fantastic series as well, Lotus. I'm really, really into it, yeah. I did like Lotus 3 so much, but it's good to see the original one getting some love.
Yeah, I mean, Lotus 2 also came out on the ST, so maybe, this team, because they've done such a good job on this, it would be nice if maybe they can focus their efforts on the second game next as well and give that, a bit of an STE upgrade. That would be really good. So, nice to see the STE getting a bit of love and some development on the platform as well. So if you want to download that, that will be in our show notes at theretrohour.com.
I've got a quick question for you, Dan.
Yeah.
Have you played Horizon Chase Turbo yet?
I think I've seen, that's on the Switch, isn't it?
Yeah, it's on everything at the moment, but it's just so playable. Yeah.
You know what? I've got a feeling I did buy that on my Switch about a year ago, and
it's unopened.
The Mickey again. I still haven't played it yet. Yes.
Them sealed games, man.
Even I think this is a digital download. I just haven't played it yet.
It?
So there's something for me to do this weekend. Thanks for the tip. Now, we are going to be chatting to Marcus Lindblom, stories from Inside Nintendo, Earthbound as well in just a moment. Before we do, let's just take a quick second to give a massive thank you to our wonderful friends at ExpressVPN, who've sponsored this week's episode. Now, obviously, we're all fans of Netflix, and I think it's fair to say we've completely rinsed most of our local Netflix libraries over the last 12 months that we've been mostly at home. And obviously, I mean, if you're a Netflix subscriber, they keep raising the prices so regularly. Now, the thing about it is, if you're paying for this every month, you need to be smart about this and make sure that you're getting your value by using ExpressVPN like we do. Now, we've talked about this on the show before. Netflix in your country is different from someone in America or Japan gets, because there are actually different Netflix libraries, I think around 100 of them on last count, that you can choose from. And by using ExpressVPN, you can pick which country's Netflix you access. Like, for example, if you've got a favourite show that's not on the UK Netflix, do what Ravi does, change ExpressVPN, hit the button, and suddenly you're connected to ExpressVPN USA.
Oh, yeah, and I've been watching some awesome stuff. Like, ExpressVPN is just so fast as well. I haven't got any lag on there or anything. I can just browse through really quickly. And there's some shows on there that you just can't get on UK Netflix or whichever country you're in, apart from the American one. And it works with all the different countries. So, you can check out some Australian stuff. You can check out some manga. But I've been watching The Leprechaun with Warwick Davies. Do you remember that film?
I do remember.
Is that
it.
like infamously a terrible movie?
The first one's all right, man, with Jennifer Aniston.
It's number 2, isn't it? That's meant to be.
Oh God, yeah, it's such a good film. But Lep in the Hood was the later one. So.
A Leprechaun in the Hood, Leprechaun in Space.
Yeah, I've been watching Tom Cruise go mental on Leah Remini Scientology in the Aftermath, and that's Leah Remini of King of Queens as well.
Yeah,
which is really insane, that TV show. And then I've been watching Jericho as well, which was one about a nuclear explosion that happened in America, and then this town called Jericho gets separated, and they have to try and restore the power and communications and stuff. And it's all really nerdy, but also post-apocalyptic, which is really good fun. So I've been using Express to watch all of these, and I can watch it on my phone, or I can do it on a router level. So I've actually got it set up on my router I just switch it, and then suddenly one of my Wi-Fi networks becomes American.
Yeah, and it works on smart TVs, your phone, your laptop, your PC. And the good thing about it is it's obviously you can watch it in HD, zero buffering. It's really fast as well. Not just for Netflix, you can use it to unlock shows from other streaming services. If you're in America, you want to watch a bit of BBC iPlayer, you can do that. So we want you to be smart. Stop paying full price for streaming services and only getting a fraction of their content. Get your money's worth by signing up to ExpressVPN right now. And by using our exclusive link, you will get 3 months for free on top of a 1-year subscription. So claim it right now and help out the podcast by going to expressvpn.com/retro. That's expressvpn.com/retro to learn more. And a big thank you to our friends at ExpressVPN. Now, of course, we do have a Patreon as well that we run, and we do mention this all the time, that the Patreon is the lifeblood of this show. Any costs that we get, our equipment, our web hosting, all of that, getting the audio to you each week, it's all thanks to our patrons. The cost of doing this show that we have regularly is all paid for by our patrons. And of course, we give a little back in return as well.
Yeah, so there's like 3 levels of patron that you can do. You can do silver supporter, gold, or platinum. And you get different rewards on each one. So the first one, silver supporter, you get an ad-free episode. And that's like £3.50. So it's kind of like about 80p per episode, which is really incredibly cheap. And you also...
That's like a can of Coke.
A can of Coke or a chocky bar, yeah. And then the gold level, you get a bonus episode of the After Hours podcast, which is the one that we do behind the scenes. And then platinum, you get a T-shirt as well. You get 2 mentions in the Hall of Fame, and you get everything else from the other tiers.
Yeah, and really the reason you're doing this, I mean, you do get that extra podcast that we do, a couple of times a month we try and do this. And this is, we do different themes around each episode. And these are, full, proper podcasts. I mean, I think the last one was probably longer than our regular episode,
yeah, because we love chatting in it, so it just goes on and on.
The thing is, we don't tend to edit them either. So they just end up being like 2 hours long, which is like, whoops.
And of course, you can join us for our monthly patrons hangouts as well. We just did one on Sunday evening, as great. Always. Oh, what kind of things did we talk about this week?
Oh, God.
We were talking
Sunday,
about
I can't remember.
We were talking about adverts. We were talking about... You know what? There was something we were like, I'm going to mention that on the podcast because that was really interesting. And I can't remember what it was now. It was like cassette tapes or something mad like that. But we always end up on like some crazy like retro kind of topic, but not necessarily gaming, don't we?
Old video formats.
Yeah.
We were talking about that. We were talking about like VHS quality. Mm-hmm. Stuff like that. Yeah. Oh, it's really good fun. And also it's just good fun to see other patrons and talk about stuff that they've got. Like we had a couple of new faces, which was really nice.
Yeah, we always do a bit of collection porn, don't we? Show off what you've got. So that's always fun. I mean, we'd love to see you there on our next one that will be coming up in a few weeks' time and unlock all of those episodes of the Retro Hour After Hours and keep this podcast going. You can back us on there on our website at theretrohour.com. And of course, you will get a mention in the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. Like this week, thank you, Jonathan Quilter,
Peter Simone,
Rob Hubers,
Sam Rhimes,
and Pierre Cressman,
who all made donations into the running of the show. And if you'd like to do the same, you'll find it on our website, theretrohour.com. Right then, time to get some inside stories from Nintendo and, of course, the classic Earthbound with our special guest, Marcus Lindblom, is next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time for our favourite bit of the show when we welcome on our very special guest. And today, we're going to be talking about some really interesting games. One of the biggest gaming company in the world, of course, Nintendo, and the cult classic Super Nintendo game Earthbound, and lots more as well with our special guest this week. Welcome to the show, Marcus Lindblom. Hello.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure to have you on. Now, before we get into your time at Nintendo and the amazing work that you did there, that I know particularly Earthbound's become a cult classic over the years. I mean, let's kind of wind right back to the beginning. What was it initially that got you into computers and video games? Do you remember where it all started?
Oh, my goodness. Well, so I'm certainly not terribly young. So, the first game I actually remember playing was like Pong. And I think the first game that we paid for was like a little tank battle game, many years ago. This would have been like early 70s or something, I would think. So I've played a lot of electronic games, but I also was a big board game fan. So for me, games have been kind of a lifelong hobby. played D&D in the 70s and stuff like that too. So I was kind of a gamer for a long time. And then I went to college, found girls, got off games for a bit, but got back into video games while I was there and just played a lot of arcade kind of stuff. And then also moved to Japan after I married my wife, and we were there for we thought we were going to be there 6 months. We ended up being there for 4 years, and we stayed long enough that I got to see a lot of arcade games come and go. And that was the first place I actually ever played. It was a Famicom when I played it there. So that was the first real home system I had, aside from little systems that in the 70s I think my parents had bought, that played Pong and things like that. But it wasn't even like an Atari. So that was sort of the background, and did a bit of computer program work in it would have been like 1980 when I was in high school. Took an electronics class and we did programming. So that was my little bit of exposure to BASIC and things like that. So, but I've been around games and technology for a long time. So. Yeah,
your time in Japan really interests me, actually. I mean, that must have been a really exciting place to be. I mean, from what I read, you were there in the late 80s.
Yeah, 86 to 90 were the years that we stayed. And yeah, I mean, it was part of the sort of economic bubble that they went through. So it was really nice. My wife is half Japanese, so we could stay, and I didn't have to do any, have a sponsor or anything like that. And so I was basically tutoring English. And so it was nice and easy because there was, people had a lot of money, and I could sort of take on as many students as I wanted, and made enough money to, have a nice, sort of decent lifestyle. And yeah, just kind of enjoyed the country. And, I would go to different parts of Tokyo almost every day and just kind of wander around until I had a class that would start or something. And, then hop the trains and go to where I needed to go. But yeah, part of that day was spent, wasting an hour or three in the arcades and stuff. But yeah, it was a great time, and played a lot of stuff, really, got introduced to all kinds of different games at that time, which was great, and kind of prepared me obviously for the time when I started at Nintendo.
Well, it was kind of the electronic center of the universe right there. And, there must have been amazing stuff on the streets and just walking around, seeing all the new devices coming out in the 80s as well.
Oh yeah, it was pretty crazy. I mean, I would go through Shinjuku, most days, because that was sort of the station that my train line dropped off in the main part of Tokyo, and there was always lots of stores and things that you could go and wander around in Shinjuku. And I would go over to Akihabara, which is the sort of electronic city or whatever they call it, and there was always stuff to wander around and look at there. So yeah, there was so many things that were new and different and exciting. And yeah, it was a ton of fun, and sort of being young and not having anything to really, tie me down much in terms of overbearing time and things like that. I got to do a lot of exploring, which was fun.
Well, was it your time in Japan that made you want to work in the industry, and how did that transition to you working for Nintendo?
Well, so when I lived there, I had picked up, enough of the language to kind of get by. Didn't read a ton, but I could speak, relatively well. And when I came back, I had actually dropped out of university just because I'd kind of gotten bored with it and stuff, which was kind of too bad, I guess. But when I came back, I figured I should go back to school. And the thing that was attractive about Nintendo was and this was back in the day where they would just advertise for jobs in the newspaper. And it was like a job that I could work before I went to school, which made it really great for, my studies and things like that. And we got full benefits at 30 hours of work, which was great. So yeah, as a company, it was, a really good place to work. They treated everyone well. And back in those days, when you first were hired, it was, hired on as a Nintendo employee. You didn't have to go through sort of a temp agency, which these days you generally do. So yeah, it was kind of a special time, and being an employee was a lot of fun. I didn't start in the games group. I actually started in the customer service area, and, going and deciding to work at Nintendo, like I said, my time in Japan, I hoped was going to be a positive and that kind of thing. And maybe it did help with getting me hired, but, it was funny. It was like, I remember you go and you would, take sort of a test that checked to see if you knew how to hook up a television and things like that, for for customer service, because you were basically helping people with systems and stuff like that in the customer service area. And then later we started doing more gameplay stuff. And so I did some gameplay counseling kind of work as well. But yeah, I did that for a while until I got into the games group.
I find it interesting you mentioned you started in customer service. I mean, did you get to man the infamous Nintendo hotline and answer gamers' questions? What was that like then?
Well, so we did some. So the way the whole sort of customer service / sort of gameplay counselor thing happened is when I first started, there were people that were on the customer service side, and then there were people that were hired strictly for gameplay. I got in on the customer service side, and so we did things like answered questions about how to hook up a system. We would set up Nintendo Power subscriptions. We would, set up the return numbers and things that when someone had a system that wasn't working and they needed to send it back for repair, we set that all up so that, there was instructions for them so that we would be able to take a system and repair it. So that was all the customer service side. And when I first started, that was the main work we did. And then the gameplay counselors, of course, answered questions on, any game that somebody called in and had a question about, if they could answer it. They usually could, but there were every once in a while there'd be something really obscure and hard. But the customer service line was an 800 number, and the gameplay counselor number was long distance. So for us, we on the customer service side, we would get just tons of calls, and thankfully most of them were legit calls. Every once in a while you get sort of weird ones. But at one point they decided that because the calls were so heavy for like the top 10 games, they asked if customer service people wanted to start taking gameplay calls for those top 10 games. And so I signed up for that and ended up, taking calls on things like Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Brothers 3 and, all of the main popular games that were out at that time. So I did a bit of those things. And then I was probably in customer service for a couple of years, and then I actually did move into what they call the correspondence group, where I wrote letters back to people. So that I did for like a year as well before I got into the games group. So I sort of saw a lot of the, customer-facing side of things in that first 2 to 3 years.
Well, obviously we're going to get into Earthbound soon, but I mean, obviously back then a lot of Nintendo games were Japanese conversions, and famously a lot of them had very poor translation. Do you know what the process was for doing it? In kind of your early part of your career there? Well,
I hesitate to say there was necessarily much of a process. It was, there were a lot of games that really didn't have much, text in them and things like that, so it wasn't a big deal. Like the first game I worked on when I got into the games group was a game called Wario's Woods. It was kind of a puzzle game. It was kind of cool because it was the last NES game that Nintendo put out, so I got to work on that. And then they also did a Super NES version of it as well. But, that had really minimal text. So that was, a super simple kind of localization, if you will. But other games, the process would be different from game to game. Some developers would, do things like make text boxes that would fit the text that you wanted to put into it. And others, you would have to like count characters, and, you'd get like 3 lines and 40 characters per line. And that was all you would get. And depending on what they did in Japanese, you would only get that many text boxes as well. So the translating work was sort of varied from game to game, and it could be pretty hard at times.
You were really into RPGs. Was there much of a market for them in the USA, like outside of Zelda?
Well, so it was kind of interesting. I mean, the one thing that probably more than anything kind of determined how well RPGs were going to be received in the US for a while, at least, was while I was in customer service, they had a deal where if you got a year of Nintendo Power magazine, you would get they called it Dragon Warrior, and it was Dragon Quest in Japan. But you would get the first game in that series for free. So that was the game that, most people got exposed to role-playing games with when you're talking about Nintendo. And, for a lot of people, it wasn't something that they enjoyed that much, because it was relatively grindy and a bit slow. And for a lot of people, it was something that they were happy to have the game for free because they were probably going to get Nintendo Power anyway. But didn't really spark a huge RPG audience in the US. Even Final Fantasy, when it came out, I mean, there was certainly people that played it and enjoyed it and stuff, but, it wasn't like the huge kind of seller that it would become later.
You were associate producer on Tin Star as well. What memories do you have of that?
Well, so yeah, I mean, it was a game that we went back and forth with the developer, and I'm going to totally blank on the developer's name all of a sudden, but they were in the UK, and I just remember that we did a lot of back and forth in terms of what was the best way to use it was the Super Scope, it was called, so it was sort of the light gun for the Super NES, and how to make that sort of a fun part of the game. And I remember going back and forth about what to do with the sort of gunslinging sort of portion of the game, but it was a fun time to just work on any game for me, because Tin Star was the second game I worked on, and it was one where I had a bit more input into stuff that was going on in the game. So, but the developer was really good, and I felt like the game at least did a pretty good job of representing what the Super Scope needed to do and be. But yeah, it was it was a kind of an interesting game. I don't know if it sold well in the UK at all because it was a UK developer, but it didn't do huge numbers in the US. But still, it was a fun game to work on.
And the Super Scope is such a cool accessory, wasn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of people thought it was kind of a little too bulky and stuff. Sort of having to quote unquote put it on your shoulder and all this kind of stuff. But all of the light guns and stuff like that Nintendo supported for all those sort of years in those early systems. I don't know that they ever got supported, quite as well as they could have been, but it's a tougher medium to like sort of build games for when you're using a light gun. But it was still fun to work on a system that or on a game that supported the light gun.
Well, let's get into Earthbound then. When did you first hear about it, and how did you get involved in the project?
Oh man, if I remember right, I mean, so I first heard about it, I think from a guy that actually still works at Nintendo named Dan Osen, who is a guy who worked in what they called the Treehouse at that time. And I think initially they had, asked Dan if he, had time to work on it. And he kind of started doing some things for sort of like an internal demo and did some localization work on a number of lines, and probably got a bit of the first town in and stuff like that. Well, I know he did because there's a couple of jokes in there that are definitely his. But he worked on it for a bit. And then I think if I remember right, I think he was going to go work on Donkey Kong Country and didn't have time then to work on Earthbound, and, suggested that maybe I'd be a good person to work on it. And, I was really excited to work on an RPG because, I had enjoyed them. And I think I knew that it wasn't going to necessarily be like a super high profile game, but just the idea that you get to work on a title that, has a lot of text and a lot of chance for creativity and things like that. I was really excited to work on the game.
Was there much of Dan's work left in the final product?
Oh yeah. Yeah. There's certainly, bits and pieces, the two lines that I remember the most that I certainly know are things that were in when I got it. So I'm pretty sure that it's stuff that Dan did, but the Fuzzy Pickles line is one that Dan would have done. And then there's the line in the first town where you go up to a door and it's the Yesterday joke, basically the Beatles song Yesterday. And it's like blank, 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 TERDAY. Do you know what goes in the blank? And it's yes, no. That was a Dan joke too. Those I remember I didn't do, but there was certainly a lot of other stuff in like the first town that I ended up doing because it wasn't all, implemented early on. So, but he had a few things certainly that were in there.
I mean, obviously in Japan, it was known as a sequel to the game Mother that came out in 1989 that wasn't released in the US. How did you go about disassociating it with the Mother series for the American market?
Well, I mean, it was one of those weird kind of things. Like I think people that know the Earthbound franchise know that the first one had actually been localized, and so there was the version floating around even in the office at the time of Mother, and I had a chance if they told me if I wanted to play it, I certainly could. But I don't think if I remember right, I don't think I actually ever really played the first one, mostly because there was just so much work to do with Earthbound that I ended up feeling like I just didn't have time to, put 40 hours or something into playing Mother, and just kind of dove into Earthbound and started working on it right away. But it was around, and the similarities in terms of some of the story aspects and characters and things like that certainly are there no matter what, because it's Itoi's writing and it's Itoi's story, and so there was going to be that thread no matter what. But for me, I kind of went into Earthbound pretty fresh.
You did the English localization. Did you change any aspects of the game or story to kind of fit that Western audience?
Oh yeah, there was a number of things that needed to change for the game, but the one thing that Nintendo had was a number of standards that they didn't necessarily care about in Japan, but they did care about for North America. So there was a number of things that they changed to fit those standards in the U.S. Like, for example, there was supposed to be no references to like alcohol, for example, in any game like that. So in the Japanese version, what basically references what is essentially beer, and people all know that and stuff. But in English, we changed it to coffee just to keep it safe on the Nintendo side. And we couldn't have any like religious references. We had to take crosses out of the game, so there was all of this sort of visual stuff. We also did things like we changed the hospital from having a red cross to a green cross, all of that kind of normal stuff. But then in the course of just doing the localization for the language, there was a handful of puzzles or things like that we did end up changing, just because there was the feeling that they were too quote unquote Japanese, if you will. And the one thing that was nice is that the developer in Japan was a company called Ape that I mentioned earlier, and they really wanted a good localization, and so they were happy to do whatever it took. They wanted the game to sell well in the United States, of course, and so understandably they were excited to make sure that stuff was in there that would make sense to a U.S. audience. So there were a few things that we went through and we decided it was worth changing. And probably the most well-known example is that there's a couple of blocking points in the game, and in Japan they're like octopus. There's like an iron octopus, and it's a really Japanese thing. So they wanted us, they were keen to sort of have us change it from an octopus to something else that could be equally goofy, but a little less Japanese culturally. So in terms of trying to come up with something that would work, with the octopus, you have to get an octopus eraser to get rid of this iron statue, and then you can keep going. And then there's another blocker in that same sort of vein. It's a little Japanese doll. And these Japanese dolls are called kokeshi. And the word to erase in Japanese is, eraser, I should say, is keshi. Like keshigomu is what you would call like a pencil eraser. And so there was a sort of play on words with the kokeshi keshi, because you would have to erase the kokeshi doll. So in terms of trying to think of something to come up with to replace it with, sort of took a few weeks to try to think of things, and then you just start running out of time, and you just sort of say, okay, we're going to go with this. And so we ended up with a pencil, an iron pencil, and then an eraser. So you have to erase the pencil, and then you have to do the eraser to erase the other iron eraser to get past that. So that was probably the most involved change, in a sense, just because we had to change the artwork as well. Text wise, we changed tons of stuff though.
Well, I was going to ask about that actually, because I know the game was actually known for its humour, which was quite different to a lot of RPGs at the time. And did you find there was like a difference between what a Japanese audience would find humorous and an American audience? Did you have to change much of the humour in the game?
The funny thing is, I would say no. Not in. I mean, we would change a lot of the Japanese references, and things that are definitely Japanese, we would go in and redo or retouch, but we would sort of try to keep it in that same kind of vein. When I started working on it, the developer basically said, in Japanese, this is a weird game. It's got a lot of odd things in it in Japanese, and there's a lot of jokes that people don't necessarily get either. And and they told me, you can be as kind of quirky as you want to be. So it was great to have that kind of support and just to sort of go in and do what I thought could be, a lot of fun. And, the great thing is that the group I was in, I didn't work inside the treehouse. I was in a different group that was in a different part of the floor, because there were basically 2 development groups at Nintendo at that time. And the thing that was great is that the guys I worked with we were all really good friends and had a lot of fun and did a lot of joking around and stuff. And some of those things got incorporated into Earthbound. And it was, a really easy thing to sort of be in that atmosphere and create sort of a very goofy, sort of quirky game like that. And I drew on a lot of stuff that, I had seen, and just entertainment and stuff I had seen over the years. I don't know, this is probably not terribly, politically correct to say this these days, sadly. But like, I used to watch Benny Hill when I was a kid. So there were jokes from Benny Hill that I kind of threw in every once in a while here or there, just kind of variations of a Benny Hill, little joke. So there was that kind of stuff. There was Looney Tunes, kind of Bugs Bunny kind of stuff in there that, I sort of took variations of. So I was lucky. I got to do all kinds of weird, sort of quirky stuff when I was writing the game. And because it was weird and quirky in Japanese, it was pretty easy to make it weird and quirky in English.
I also think as well, talking about the differences, the fact that the game was essentially set in America. Admittedly, it was called Eagle Land, but, it was meant to be America. So kind of translating the Japanese impression of America to an American audience, was that much of a challenge?
Well, so I think one of the advantages I had was the fact that I had lived in Japan for those 4 years. So I had really kind of gotten used to what Japanese people's image of America is during that time that I lived there. So it made it easier for me, I think, to deal with that sort of odd, sort of outsider's view of what the U.S. is than maybe other people. And so I didn't feel, too bad about leaving in sort of odd things that Itoi had written. And, I was perfectly fine with sort of having America have this weird, idealized, kind of view. And so, yeah, I mean, I didn't have any problems doing it. It wasn't difficult for me, I don't think. Other people may have had a bit more of a tough time, not if you didn't have that sort of cultural background of understanding how Japanese people view America. But I was fortunate. I kind of knew that.
Did you end up collaborating with the Japanese team much? Like, it must be really challenging in the pre-internet era.
Oh, yeah. So the thing that I was immensely fortunate to have was a guy came over to the U.S. from Ape. His name was Masayuki Miura. And so Miura-san and I worked just side by side, basically, for, he was in the U.S. for, like a good probably 6 weeks, something like that. And so every day he would kind of explain to me things that, I was seeing in the text, because the game wasn't playable for a good while, because they were making all of these changes, to graphics and, putting in rules to deal with American grammar versus Japanese grammar. So it wasn't really playable. And so, and basically I was working off of like stacks of paper, which goes back to the question about process. There really wasn't much of a process, unfortunately, but, it's what we had. And he had a small sort of portable word processor. And so he had all of those text files loaded into the word processor, and he would go in and, put in translations that I would do on the paper. And so he was doing a lot of data entry and also explaining things to me as we went through the process. And so he would try to explain to me, what was going on when a line was spoken, and that whether it was, crucial to the story, or even if it was just something that was, sort of a NPC line that didn't necessarily have much to do with aspects of the game. But it was great because I could go in and, kind of write, knowing a bit more about what was going on around that line. But other than that, I mean, and the thing is, when you look at the text files, it isn't like in sequence or anything. It's just stuff is sort of scattered all over. And I've told people this before, and I think it's really true. I was really fortunate as well that the game was as quirky and as weird as it was, because I could get away with sort of odd sounding lines that I didn't necessarily intend to sound as odd as they may, because I didn't necessarily 100% know what was going on before or after that line. So sometimes the oddity is just by chance. So yeah, I got lucky because, having a weird game, you get away with a lot more.
Well, what was the time pressure like working on the game? I mean, I read that you only had a few months to do it. That must have been like insanely long days.
Yeah, it was. I suppose that the example I can give as to sort of the time pressure. So if I remember right, it was pretty much right after Christmas, and my first daughter was born on February 8th. And that day I was out of the office for her getting born, but then I went into the office every day straight for like the next 28 days. And I mean, not necessarily proud of it, but it was a different time, I guess is the best way to say it. Because my daughter was born and they knew I had worked on it so hard, Masayuki Miura asked me, do I want to put my daughter's name in the game somewhere? And, I thought about it and I thought, yeah, sure, why not, And there's a part of the game called Magicant, and there's a little girl character in the Magicant area who in Japanese just says something like, let's run and dance and play, something along those lines. But I changed it, or he let me change it to my name is Nico, which is my daughter's name. Let's run and dance and play. So I got to put the name in, and for a while, people didn't really understand why that character had a name, and so many other characters in the game don't. So it was kind of funny for a while. That was kind of a weird little speculative thing that the Earthbound fandom would guess about and stuff. But that was probably the most Easter eggy thing I think, we put in. I mean, just for personal stuff, there's things in the game that, I put in because, like I said, the guys I worked with were pretty funny. There's a line at the end of the game where Pokey says, one of his very last lines is he says to you, he says, spankety, spankety, spankety. And this is something that someone in the games group used to say. And I always liked it and thought it was funny. And so I put it in. And, for me, knowing that was, a guy I worked with who had a really good sense of humor, a line from him, was kind of a nice thing for me, but, it doesn't really mean much for anybody else. But, for me, that's the kind of little Easter egg that I kind of got.
Well, one thing about the game that gives it some serious pedigree is the fact that it was produced by Satoru Iwata, who, of course, went on to become Nintendo's president and CEO.
Yeah.
That must give the game some real credence these days.
Oh, it's funny. I went back and looked at the credits on the Super NES Classic, and for some reason, I think someone sent me the credits list from the game for whatever reason. Oh, I think they were sending me the credits because I actually had another game on the Super NES Classic as well. But that's a sort of separate story. But and I went and I looked at the credits and I realized that my name appeared right below Iwata-san's name. So I remember when I saw that, I was like, it was a bittersweet kind of, moment.
Immortalized.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I mean, yeah. And even though, when the game came out and it didn't sell and it wasn't that popular, obviously, I had put so much time and effort and sort of, a lot of just my own personality into the game. It was certainly disappointing that it didn't sell, but I felt like I had done just about everything I could. And, at least when I saw the reviews and stuff, there wasn't many that said, that the writing or whatever was the part that was the issue. And so at least I knew that I didn't, do anything to mess up or, whatever you want to say. It was satisfying that it made it at least an impact. But yeah, for a long time, I didn't even talk about the game with people.
Well, I think, the fact that it's become a cult classic proves what a quality job both the Japanese and your team in America did as well on the game. And I know Nintendo did spend about $2 million on the marketing, which at the time, I remember reading that it was quite controversial. And a lot of people think they did completely the wrong thing in the marketing of that game. And that was a reason that, it didn't sell as well as it should. What was your opinion of their marketing efforts back then?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I mean, playing up the sort of grossness or whatever you want to call it that the marketing campaign kind of did. I wasn't sure if that was necessarily the right way to play it, but I mean, knowing that the game was sort of quirky and funny and interesting in so many different ways and stuff, I kind of figured it was their expertise, and you sort of hope that they're right. I know that, like you said, a lot of people sort of downplayed the marketing as being much of a help to the game. I mean, in retrospect, you sort of wonder if you want to necessarily say this game stinks for a marketing line, but that's what they did. And, you kind of hope that wasn't a reason why it didn't sell. But, to be honest, if I had to pick one reason that it didn't sell, I think for me, the biggest reason was the cost. I'll be honest, and graphics secondary, just because at that time everybody wanted the best looking graphics you could get. But really, the cost was certainly another factor, in my opinion, because it was, I think in some places it was $80 US to buy the big box. And that's a lot of money. And it was a lot of money in those days.
And I think as well, that this game stinks. It seemed very un-Nintendo-like at the time. I mean, it kind of felt more like something Sega would have done.
Yeah, and now that you mention it, I mean, I suppose that there may have easily been some of that desire to, steal some of the Sega thunder, if you will, because Sega had that reputation for being, a rule breaker and, more brash and, sort of in your face. And I think that Nintendo was probably at that time thinking, okay, maybe we need to, get a little more edgy. And that might have been a part of the decision-making process. And I think that, like I said, I like to hope that it didn't really necessarily make a huge difference, but I know that it's been criticized over the years, certainly.
Well, there was a huge kind of RPG import scene, like we mentioned. And, the game got a cult following. Did you see this as something special?
Yeah, so in terms of the actual following, so this is sort of another sort of angle that, like I mentioned, I mean, I probably went through a period of 4 to 5 years where, I didn't really even think much about the game, because when you work in the game business, you work on a title, you ship the game, and, ideally you've got another project to move on to right away. And so, that was the way it was for me. And so, I had moved on in my career. I ended up leaving Nintendo in 96 and went to EA and worked on sports stuff. And that was a lot of work and, sort of high pressure in a lot of ways, because you're working on a game that has to be released every year. So, you've got to get everything done. And so I was there for a couple of years, and, it's very heads down and very focused. And, at the end of the day, I didn't even really know that Earthbound had gathered, much of a following. I just sort of figured, it didn't necessarily review that well. I had seen it in bargain bins here and there, and probably should have bought a few of them, but never did, because I had my own copy, so I didn't really think about it. But
yeah, they're worth a bit now, aren't they?
Yeah, sadly. Knowing what they're worth now, I wish I would have grabbed a few. But with all of that stuff that I had seen, I didn't even really think much about the game and didn't even really bring it up much. I mean, I worked with guys, at the end of the 90s who later on came back and told me, they said, how come you never told me you worked on Earthbound? And I just said, I didn't think it was a big deal when we were working together. But, slowly I became aware, and I don't even remember why or how. Maybe it was because I was looking up a date for the game for when it actually came out, and I did a Google search in those days, or, well, it wouldn't have been Google, it would have been AOL search or
Alta
something.
Vista or something.
Yeah, Alta Vista, yeah.
Ask Jeeves.
Ask Jeeves, yeah, there's your other. We can grab all of our old search engine names. But yeah, so it would have been one of those, I'm sure, and I suspect, it would have been the kind of thing where Starman.net popped up. And I remember, the first time I ever looked at it, and I thought, oh, it's got a few fans. That's kind of nice. I'm glad that it didn't get totally forgotten. And then, every few months I would think, oh, maybe I'll just pop in and take a look. And the fandom is, I realized pretty quickly, very dedicated. And, that was the place where I first sort of saw people post and say, why is this character named Nico in the game? And that's what sort of made me kind of think, okay, it's kind of fun to come back and read people's theories about why there's a character named Nico. And, of course, nobody guessed correctly. I mean, they all had other ideas, whether it was Ness's old girlfriend or something weird like this, But it was always kind of fun to read. And I don't think I actually explained it to anybody until, might have been 2013, was the first time I met somebody from Fangamer, which is what the company that Starman had kind of started up. And I was going to the PAX convention, and I thought, well, I might as well just go up and just let them know that I worked on it, and thank them for the fact that they kept the game alive all these years. And went up and introduced myself to somebody, and it was kind of cool. I mean, they kind of got all excited and called in people and brought them over, and ended up meeting a bunch of them and things, and have generally kept the relationship going, all these years with those guys. They're a really good group.
The game at the time, like you said, that the sales figures were disappointing, but in the decades that have followed, it's got this cult following now and this really loyal audience. And I think that must have seemed like validation did it when it was included and opened up to a whole new audience who didn't get to experience it back in the day, apart from like on grey imports outside of Japan and North America. When it was included on the Super Nintendo Classic, the mini system, were you aware that was going to happen, and what did you think of it?
So no, I wasn't aware of it, but I was, kind of pleasantly surprised that they, thought that it was worth putting in. I'll be honest, the moment where I felt like it was, the most validating, I guess, for the work I did on the game was, thankfully, and I don't know that this would happen anymore, but probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, there was 2 or 3 like top 100 games of all times lists, and Earthbound ended up being in those lists. And that was the moment where I thought, okay, maybe I can, go ahead and die now and be fine. Because I would have never thought that I would have worked on a game that was, in the top 100 games of all time.
You also did the localization for Star Fox 2 in 2019.
That was the other one. Yeah, that was the other one that was on the Super NES Classic, that it didn't ship for years and years. And it was, I've been fortunate in my career. I've actually shipped, pretty much everything I've worked on, except for that one didn't. And we actually had finished it, but, it was for Super NES, and, it basically turned into, the N64 version of Star Fox, but they had done Star Fox 2, and I got to do the localization work on that too. And that was one that was like a tougher localization in a way, just because it was, like I mentioned before, they had like strict text box limits. And so all of the text in Japanese, which is, because it's symbols, you get a lot more into a single symbol than in English, where we have to spell it out with multiple characters. That was a lot harder, a localization in a weird way than, sort of the stuff I did in Earthbound. I mean, Earthbound was hard because it was just a lot, but, sort of mechanically, it was easier in a sense to do the Earthbound localization, because Star Fox 2, because I only had a certain number of characters, and I would like pour over the text over and over just for like single characters, and, using contractions of words just to gain an extra character to get one word and turn it from a singular thing to a plural thing, because in English it makes a difference, whereas in Japanese they don't really have that. Stuff like that, but yeah, it was fun working on that game too. It was a long time ago, but I mean, I remember, sort of communicating with Dylan Cuthbert a bit, which is kind of cool.
Wicked. From Argonaut.
Yeah. And I know he's still in Japan. I follow him on Twitter, which is kind of nice. And, he's done so much stuff over the years. But yeah, it was one of those other games that, I'm pretty proud to have worked on as well.
Well, he went to EA after Nintendo. How did that come about, and what was it like working for Electronic Arts at that time?
So I went to EA because, when I worked at NOA, I kind of always knew that generally you're not going to get to do much in the way of working with the actual development team unless I would have like moved to Japan. And because I had a family, that wasn't really as much of an option. But, I wanted to be involved with the development team more closely. So going to Electronic Arts, I went to EA Canada, where they were working on the sports stuff. And I had always, enjoyed sports and sports games as well. When I first got there, I got there because I was doing localization. So I ended up doing localization work for there was a Need for Speed title. I think it was Need for Speed SE that came out on the PC. I also worked on localization for NHL and for NBA Live. Those were the titles that were in the group I was attached to at EA Canada. And so my first year was strictly doing localization across all of those various titles. And then the next year, I moved into just sort of the associate producer role and worked on NBA Live 98. and still ended up taking care of the localization for NBA Live, but also served as the associate producer of that. And it was a pretty crazy time as well, just because, like I mentioned, it's a tough environment where you've got to put out a game every year, and there's really nothing worse for a sports game than to miss the opening day of a sports season. And so we would do everything possible to make those dates, and and it was a bit of sleeping under your desk and things like that. So development wise, it was sort of classic old time sort of crunchy development schedule. But in the end, I mean, the games were always, I think, pretty good quality. So we were proud of what we did, and it was a good group of guys up there too. But with NBA Live, it was very much sort of built around as much realism as you could sort of put into the game, but still be fun. So their goal was to make it closer to a more of a simulation than sort of a jam type of game. But we did have to do a lot of work with the NBA. I mean, we got things like player portraits, and we worked with known announcers for NBA games. When I worked on the localization, I was fortunate because I also got to go over to like France and work with a nationally known French NBA announcer in France, and Italy and Spain, and it was nice to see how popular the NBA was even in Europe at that time.
Well, you were planning on doing a book as well, and I heard Nintendo kind of blocked it. What was the story there?
Oh, I still know guys over at Nintendo, and I had thought it would be maybe kind of fun to just put out a book that just kind of ran through the lines of Earthbound, and if there was a story behind anything in particular, go ahead and jot it down, and maybe do a book that would hopefully sort of give fans a little more insight into the individual bits in the game and stuff like that. And I went and talked to a friend of mine, and I mentioned it. And I think he decided, well, maybe I should ask and see if anybody, is going to care about it. And it may have even been that I asked him, go ahead and double check and see if anybody's going to have an issue. And then when I talked to him later, they said, well, they'd rather you didn't if you, I think they knew that they couldn't really stop me, quote unquote. But they sort of said they'd prefer me not to. And, in thinking about it, I decided that out of respect to the company that, gave me my start and things like that, I would sort of acquiesce to their request. So in the end, I did not do it, which is, kind of too bad in a way, but it's one of those things that Nintendo is very protective of stuff. And, even though if I remember right, they sort of made it sound like, well, they don't want people to know about what, our process was. Well, like I said, there was really no process. I mean, it was just brute force sort of work. But, because they had made that request, and like I said, out of just respect to the company and stuff, I decided not to do it. But yeah, it was kind of too bad. I mean, it wasn't like they sent me a weird like cease and desist letter or something weird like that. There wasn't anything. It's much more of the gentleman's agreement kind of a thing almost.
Which is why it's been great to hear your stories, Marcus, because, we found doing the show that we've had several guests on that worked for Sega back in the day, but, Nintendo, it is quite hard to kind of get in there and find out what happened inside the company. So it has been really interesting finding out your memories and what it was like working there back then.
Well, that's good. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And there's so much stuff that, was going on at that time. And it was really, an exciting time in the industry and an exciting time at Nintendo. And, I was really fortunate to be there, and I was really fortunate to get to work on the stuff I did. And so, yeah, I know that Nintendo has been a huge part of people's lives, and there's always lots of questions. And that's the part that I wish Nintendo was a little more responsive to at times, is just understanding that there are people that view Nintendo and the games and things like that as a huge part of their life, and forming their opinions and hobbies and all this kind of stuff. So, that's a part of it that I'm always a little bit disappointed that Nintendo doesn't do more for, but they're a big company and they kind of make their own choices, I guess.
What are you working on these days then, Marcus? You still in the games industry?
I am. After working at a number of different places, I actually had a company for about 10 years that me and a couple of guys started. And so we did a lot of consulting work and things like that with with various groups. But then just recently, at the beginning of this year, I started working with a small indie company called Poorly Timed Games, who are kind of working on a game that hopefully they're an indie developer, and they're hoping to get funding. And so I've been, really happy to work with them. They're a really good group. I'm desperately hoping that we get our funding in line. And once that happens, everything will, hopefully be in place for at least a couple of years, I would think. And so I'm working with those guys and kind of in a producer project management sort of role. And, it's been a interesting year just because of COVID and things, but yeah, they're scattered all over the place, and doing the best I can to, help kind of wrangle the project.
It really does feel like the indie scene has kind of brought a lot of excitement back to gaming, a lot of creativity as well.
Oh yeah. Well, really the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, the industry has changed so much. I mean, whether it's the indie scene, because of, the ability to self-publish is so different than it was years and years ago. And even though this started more than 5 to 8 years ago, but it became so much easier now, is things like just being able to update games after you release them and, put in more content and stuff is so much nicer than it used to be years ago. And then obviously the rise of like mobile games and things has given life to, just tons and tons of companies. And so the industry has changed a ton from when I remember it 25 years ago. But, at its heart, it's still, it's nice because it's still trying to do the same thing it was back then, which is, create good, solid entertainment for people. And the industry being as big and popular and widespread as it is now across the world is super encouraging for me, just as being a part of the game development community. But yeah, I'm hopeful that it keeps going. I do love the indie scene though. Being a part of an indie is certainly a very special thing.
Well, Marcus, it's amazing that the passion for the video games industry still burns inside you and for the medium as well. And long may it continue. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on, sharing your stories with us.
Well, thank you very much, Dan and Robbie. It was my pleasure as well. I've been super happy to see all of the stuff you guys have done with the podcast too. So, I hope you guys keep going for a long time with that as well.